So we're going to move on to our next session, and that is with Dean Nelson and Tom Moran. Who are going to be talking, and I should say too, each of the sessions are designed to kind of drop deeper into the sector of media technology. Deep, of course, is talking about B Corp and that as a strategy in general. Our next session is going to be taking a holistic look at your sustainability approach in media technology. And we're really thrilled to have Dean Nelson with iMasons is a new group to some of us, and an industry group that's focused on infrastructure, and Tom Moran, who is consultancy with Lumen, a CDN provider. So I think you'll find their conversation very interesting about this holistic approach. So off to Tom and Dean on your session. And I'll be monitoring questions in the chat. So anybody asks questions, I'll be letting you know towards the end of your session.
Great. Thanks, Barbara.
That's great. Thanks, Barbara. So I guess I'll kick us off, Dean, and I'll have you do maybe a more extended introduction than me, because I want you to talk a little bit about the iMasons and all that stuff. But I am a Mason and have been since I think 2016. I might have been a year late to the party, but it has been really a great experience for me, and I think it's kind of a transformational organization that was right place, right time, and you did some amazing work there. So I'll just briefly introduce myself. I started as a solution architect and designer actually in the media space. And before that, I was a freelance producer. So I did photography and video music production, and that's kind of my background. And I have published something that'll be in the next SMPTE journal about some of the topics that Dean and I will be talking about. And we've also got some links to some of the great stuff that Dean has written, and I'll be asking him about later. But I think I'm part of a bunch of different organizations, Jesse and the Greening of Streaming and the SDIA and various other things like that. And when you introduce yourself, Dean, and give a little bit of your background, I also want you to talk about kind of what you seem to have hit on with the iMasons, with the individual membership model that got so many people so jazzed and so involved and engaged that all of a sudden the companies came with them sort of after the fact, even though we leave our companies at the door. The Climate Accord then is a great segue into, what are the companies doing? But I'd kind of like to give maybe a little bit of the origin story along with your background.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tom. It's great to be here and great to meet everybody. I've been in the digital infrastructure space for 34 years now, as of next month, which is kind of crazy. And I've done 30 years in that on the end user or buying side. So Sun Microsystems, eBay, PayPal, and Uber. So I ran global foundation services for them. So just think of the engine underneath that runs those systems. And I had the pleasure of actually driving about $10 billion worth of projects across 3 continents. Then I left and went and started doing advisory work. And in between eBay and Uber, I decided to go back and spin up a organization, so basically a professional association. This is where Tom and I got together, and we are uniting the builders of the digital age. So it's a professional association. As Tom mentioned, we leave our companies at the door. And that started with, calls to 7 different people, kind of executives of different companies saying, why don't we get together? And what emerged from there is the organization we have today with over 7,000 participants around the world. It is representing some of the biggest and largest portfolios in the world. So over $150 billion worth of infrastructure projects across 140 countries. So the people that actually do the work, that drive the engines that enable the Internet of everything. But our goal here was to unite them on specific causes. And so that's 4 strategic pillars. It's education, inclusion, innovation, and sustainability. So I'm going to dive into the sustainability part, because what happened is by bringing people together on these 4 different initiatives, things started emerging, the alignment started happening, the unification, right, of our approaches. And the sustainability angle was we're not moving fast enough. So when you look at the digital infrastructure that serves the world, how are we digitizing this, right? And actually decarbonizing this, everything that's going on with the stuff in the world. And so we got together with the advisory council, about 40 people at a guy named Christian Bellatti's house up in Seattle. He runs their innovation centers for Microsoft. And we had one goal that day. That was to find a single thing that we could do as an industry together to accelerate our path towards carbon neutrality as a first step towards net zero. So what can we do to do that? And so the iMasons Climate Accord was born, and that basically said we are all united on reducing carbon in materials, equipment, and power. And so if you just think about that, that's the underpinnings for everything that we actually deploy. The materials that actually make up a building. So this is the concrete, steel, copper, right? Anything else that goes in to build that thing up. The equipment that goes in it, everything from the HVAC stuff back into the IT equipment, and then the power that actually is feeding that, that's enabling all that to happen. So we all aligned on that one, and everybody, it was crazy. We had, within the first 6 weeks, we had 73 companies signed up. Another 6 weeks after that, we were over 200 companies. And so this is including AWS, Google, Meta, Microsoft, 85 co-location companies, product companies, investment firms, et cetera, all aligned on this vision. So that's what we've been working on. And it's really exciting to see the industry come together on this.
Yeah, I think it's important. So today I'm sitting in Brussels at the General Assembly for Jesse, and we had a great presentation about the European Green Digital Coalition. And one of the things that they've just announced is the idea of a digital product passport, right? And it's interesting that, iMasons was kind of in front of the curve a little bit here with the idea of, the QR code on the server in the building, and what does it mean to look at the materiality of the hardware side of the equation, and how do we fix that challenge where, we have so many parts of our business that are designed around the idea that you refresh hardware every 3 or 5 years, no matter what, right? It's the same in media and entertainment with other types of equipment. Our whole idea around resilience and robustness seems to be tied to that. And yet we know now from companies like HP that refurbished hardware actually has higher margins for them. It makes more sense to be in the business. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about, you're obviously, that idea has become what you're doing with Cato, and I'll give you a chance to give a little plug for what you're doing with Cato, because I think it's super cool. And following from that, I want to talk a little bit about your kind of power capacity effectiveness part of the equation that you're driving as well.
You brought up something that's really important that I think people should think about: the concept of a carbon label. So you think about a nutrition label on a food, right? You can look at that and see what's in it and decide if you want to buy that. We took that same concept and said, can we put it on digital infrastructure? And so the carbon label is on the building. So you think about all the materials that build that building up and then the equipment inside of it. So you should be able to know the embodied carbon of that building and the equipment. Then you would have the actual carbon intensity of the energy itself. So just think of conceptually having a carbon label on a data center, and that data center is now the sum of all those elements to be able to now tell you what it is at any moment in time. Now, a carbon label is one thing, but this is most likely an API that can be called, and you can get real-time carbon information, because in the end of it, we would love to be able to know real-time carbon accounting for digital infrastructure. And then we would love to, you start talking about the Green Pass. Imagine if you could now say, opt in on all of my digital transactions to be the most sustainable. That simple selection, imagine all these different companies doing something like that, would allow you to be able to select your path, select your CDN, select your caching, select your equipment. It could now choose different things that are more sustainable, whether it's the energy itself or the building or the equipment that's running. So that's a huge concept around this, that labeling system can now be driven into decisions. So RFPs, contract specs, et cetera. Do you have a carbon label? Do you have the data itself? What is the underlying methodology when it comes down to the taxonomy of how that actual carbon accounting is done? It's exposing the data. So the transparency is very, very critical in making this actually happen. So that was what we really worked around. Now, my day job, and by the way, because iMasons is a nonprofit, we don't make any money at this. We all just care very much about, right, these 4 strategic priorities when it comes down to our association. And but in our day jobs is where we make our decisions and drive different things. How do we take the approaches that we're doing from an industry standpoint and apply it to those everyday decisions? So I have a company called Cato Digital, and Cato Digital is a bare metal platform. So we're rolling out bare metal compute, right? But we have low cost, low carbon compute in all the right places. Now, what that means is we're using second life hardware. So let me just let that sink in for a second. We're taking equipment that is retired and giving it a second life, refreshing that directly back in. We're rolling it into data centers, And we're only using the excess or wasted capacity in data centers. Think about the power allocation that's there. It's like planes that are half full all the time. We're filling those other seats with second life equipment. And then you tie that back into clean energy. Now, the reason this is important is we're aligning directly to the iMasons Climate Accord. Those three strategic priorities allow us to be able to now say, I can actually lower the carbon significantly. So will this bare metal platform have a lower carbon footprint than everything else out there? Yes. Why? It's second life. The carbon has been paid for by the first owner. We're just extending that life. So our goal here is to go after scope 3. How do we build and basically extend the life of digital infrastructure? Because guess what? 80% of the workloads on the internet do not need the latest and greatest hardware. It's like a certified pre-owned BMW. It still gets from A to B very well, right? Just because it's now 5 years old doesn't mean the car is dead. That's what we're doing with infrastructure. That is stopping the mining of the precious metals, the reassembly, the distribution, everything else to go back and build new equipment. So that's what Cato Digital is all about.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny, the person who I was just hearing speak from the EU was talking about, if you were going to pick one thing to work on, whether it was, ag, transport, whatever, all the different things, he's asking this group of industry executives, what would you work on? And we're all thinking, oh, it's probably energy or something like that. And he said, it's circularity, right? He said, if we're going to truly decouple the emissions and the growth of our services, the growth of digital infrastructure from the impact that it has, we really need to understand how to make everything a service and how to make everything circular. And that's a fundamental shift, but the cloud companies are on the front of that, right? They're already operating with business models where everything is a service. And I think it's important to understand the connection between a service-based model and sustainability, right? Because there's this idea of extended producer responsibility, right? The idea that if I put something out into the world, I need to be responsible for keeping it out of the waste stream. The guy from the EU called it extended producer ownership, which is taking that to the next level and saying, you know what, you own it. If you produce it, you own it forever. And there's a lot of value in recycling and repurposing that. But something that you touched on earlier, I think is super important, and I'll put it in context here. So the energy issue in the top 3 or 4 data center markets in the world, we are effectively out of energy. And it's constraining the growth, not only of our industry, but every other business that wants energy in those parts of the world. And that represents something I think it's really important to understand about holistic sustainability, which is that it's not your ESG report. It's not the incrementalism of we did a little bit better this year than we did last year. It's about thresholds and allocations. We are up against a limit of 1.5 degrees of warming for our planet. We are up against a lot of other thresholds as a society that we need to figure out how are we going to allocate resources effectively across all the different people who are vying for them in order in a fair and just and equitable way. And I think that's going to be one of the real big challenges. And with energy, your metric of power capacity effectiveness, I think, is so important. It doesn't just apply to data centers. Obviously, that's your expertise there, but it actually applies to the proportionality of how we use energy in so many different ways. So I wonder if you can explain that concept, for the group here.
Yeah, let me start with some baselining first, and I'm going to share an article in the chat. This is how we said definition of our infrastructure and our industry itself. So what is digital infrastructure? So we know that there are 7 million data center locations around the world. So 7 million unique locations, from the street corner that's serving the lights all the way to gigawatt campuses. Okay, so those physical locations have their own unique address. Then they have 105 gigawatts of capacity built. This is capacity that can be used, okay? Then they're using 594 terawatt hours of energy every year. 594 terawatt hours. That represents 2.4% of the global energy draw. That is digital infrastructure. That's our portfolio when you think of all the different companies that are doing that. Now, the concept of PCE, it's called power capacity effectiveness. That means how much of that capacity are we actually using? Now, this is important because, as Tom was mentioning, some of the biggest markets in the world, like Loudoun County in Virginia, which is the largest data center market deployment in the world, is out of capacity. The utilities are unable to actually now get more power distributed for these data centers. There's 2,000 megawatts that are allocated just within that county. 2,000 megawatts. And they have a 5-year lead to go back and get transmission lines to actually have more power distributed. They can generate it, they just can't get it to the location it needs to be delivered to. So when we started digging into this, we realized that all the allocations that are there, everybody buffers and over allocates, right, when it comes to capacity. So power capacity effectiveness basically says, how much power do you have? How much are you using? Plain and simple. In Loudoun County, there's 2,000 megawatts. There's 800 megawatts stranded, never used. 800 megawatts. We have 60% of the capacity utilized. So why is that? That's because we build these data centers to never go down, which means they build in extra redundancy. Then you build in more compute power. Then you build in more tolerances, everything else to ensure that if there's an outage, I don't have any impact to the service. The problem is that from a cloud standpoint, everything is moved forward with software is now where the resiliency is. The data centers still are believing they have to have a rock solid building, which means that they're stranding a whole bunch of capacity. So the tenants and the actual suppliers are in this tension for it. That's my capacity, can't share any of it. So power capacity effectiveness measures that. That data and that transparency will now start to ask the question, why do we have that? Because we should be utilizing the capacity that we've already built before we build more. 800 megawatts is a very sizable deployment. Now think about that across every data center in the world. What if they're all at 50 or 60% utilization all the time, which is in fact the reality of the majority of colocation centers. Now hyperscalers and others are really driving that up 70, 80, even 90% utilization, but the majority of it, at least half of the capacity around the world is in that level. So it's a new metric for us to go back and drive efficiency, but also sustainability, because we should use what we deploy.
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it. And I think that, you know, the traditional metric of PUE, right, is all of the power that's used for things other than the useful work in the data center, right? The cooling and everything else is everything on the right of the one. And, you know, you and I have had this conversation about it's the one that matters, right? That's the number. If you can pull that down, you know, you get a whole different game-changing kind of approach. And I think, you know, that speaks to, I guess, one of the other challenges that I feel like, you know, in the media industry in particular, I mentioned this in my SIMTI article, every time we have a buffer or resilience or robustness or what we think of as all the things we need, we have waste. And we can't afford the levels of waste that we currently have in our society, regardless of what you're talking about, right? Whether it's how you get to the store and the way you do your job and everything like that. And, you know, in this holistic approach, I'm wondering if you can talk maybe about the connection between what you are doing with these companies and with the iMasons, the other things like that, and kind of, you know, the broader ambitions of the digital infrastructure industry to have what I think of as the potential for a net positive impact, right? Because we know the potential is there. We see the fact that, you know, not all of us got on planes to have 500 people be a part of this conversation, right? Sure. But how do we measure that, and how do we talk about that in a way that contextualizes those negative externalities with positive impacts that's credible? And I'll give you a little primer. The guy at the EU said, you know, if you're a drug company and you stand up and say, I've got a drug that's going to cure this disease, people expect scientific rigor in the evidence you use to support that argument, right? How are we going to get scientific rigor in support of the net positive impact argument that we know is credible? We just haven't figured it out. And what do you think, you know, the role of people like the iMasons and the folks on this call is in developing that?
Yeah, there's really two parts of this. So if you think about digital infrastructure has basically enabled the world to be more productive, plain and simple. Without this technology, this platform we're on right now, Zoom, as you said, we'd all be flying, trying to go places, or people wouldn't be able to participate in that. So digital infrastructure has opened it up, and it's the great equalizer. When you think about it, everybody is able to participate around the world, whether it's, you know, from an economic standpoint to a connection standpoint. That is a huge boon when it comes down to humanity. So the measurements of all those things, the benefits that come from it, Many companies have reports that do that. So that's one bucket. And I think that there's always the debate about useful work and things that are actually done, but everybody's definition of useful work is different. Because, we were saying, well, the hospitals have to be there. Of course they need to be there. But what happens if you don't have a YouTube channel in parts of Africa where they don't have access to education? Is that a critical service? Yeah. Probably even more so when it comes down to elevating people out of certain things because they suddenly have access to the internet and their world opens back up. So I think that's a bucket that's really important. And by the way, it's very inspirational to me to know that what we build enables the world. And remember, there's still 2 billion people still not connected to the internet. Okay. So the second part here is what we talked about before. We must build digital infrastructure from a sustainability standpoint. In other words, we know that we use concrete, we use copper, we use steel, we use massive amounts of it. And remember, the combination of these companies, we have over 200 companies in the Climate Accord. Their combined market cap is over $6 trillion. $6 trillion. That is a lot of buying power. And so all these companies, the biggest tech companies in the world, the largest co-location companies in the world, are all focused in on trying to do that. Now, I would say that we have to get extremely creative in how this is done because we have to be carbon negative, not just neutral, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about net zero, everything balances out. It's very, very difficult, but there are technologies that we can apply that will do this. For example, there's a thing called Blue Planet Systems. Blue Planet Systems has carbon negative concrete. How the heck would you do carbon negative concrete? Well, they have a process that's able to be next to natural gas plants, and they capture the actual carbon, they sequester it in aggregate, they put the aggregate into the concrete, and they pour it into buildings, whether it's airports or bridges or data centers. The point is they have a way to go back and now sequester the actual carbon. That means that every concrete pour I have is negative carbon. So all of those. Now, how do you approach everything that's got carbon in it and do something similar to that? So, and I think that one more thing, Tom, that's really important is everybody's heard about generative AI, ChatGPT, right? All of these AI capabilities that have come out in the last 6 months. We have more growth coming in our industry than we have ever seen. And again, I've been in the industry for over 3 decades. And there's always been the promise of these things. Oh my goodness, it's going to double, it's going to triple. We've always come up with ways to be more efficient, right? So definitely that'll keep going. The difference is the world just found the easy button, and the easy button needs a massive amount of GPUs and CPUs and storage to go back and do this. Whether it's ChatGPT, AutoGPT, any of the generative AI pieces that are doing art to music to everything else, the world is engaging, right? The fastest application in history is ChatGPT. It had 1 million users in 5 days. It had 100 million users in 60. It's just insane, the growth of it, the data that's going to be there. So the predictions are that digital infrastructure will triple in the next 10 years. That's a lot of capacity. We must build everything new as sustainability as possible. So the only way that works is if you have the people that are making the decisions to do that, actually doing it. That's why the Climate Accord is so important, because we've united people to go after that, right? In everything that we're building and everything that we have.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think we may have some questions from the audience. I think we're up against time. Obviously you and I could carry on this conversation and have over beers at a few of the different iNations events. So we'll pause there and and Barbara, I don't know if you have any questions that you want to throw out from the audience.
Sure, we have a few minutes. And I was curious, can you tell us a little bit about how many media companies are part of the Climate Accord, if any? And if not enough, how do we change that equation, would you say?
I don't believe we have media companies in there right now. I know we've got studios, right?
Yeah, okay.
I think Orbital Studios is one. Yep. Okay. So the key in this is that we have to get people to understand what we're talking about. Secondly, is they can sign up just by going to climateaccord.org. It's simple. Just take your company. You can actually select to be in it. And then you can decide if you want to be in those work groups. But I think it's organizations like this that allow us to be able to say, this sector has a huge, right, opportunity. because you're where the data is. You're the place
Right.
that caches it, streams it, does all the other pieces of it. So those 7 million locations, yep, it's all the places you guys are driving. So how do we go back and make those sustainable choices for every one of those locations? Because really, it has to be every address that we've got digital infrastructure in needs to be sustainable. So how do we apply these principles across every one of those locations? That means everybody in our industry and extended industries need to actually be participating in this.
I'll jump in and wrap up quickly with a question for you, Dean. So, we have, I think, connections between a lot of different industries like media, like data. It's hard to know what is a media company now. Is Apple a media company? Is Google a media company, right? Is Amazon? Yep. But I wonder where you see the iMasons going beyond, if you could give us your kind of forward-looking future and maybe, tie into that, where do you see the important sustainability, real leapfrog progress type of events, right? Game-changing kind of events happening. And you want to give us any predictions or thoughts for ways forward or ways you'd like to see us go forward?
Yes, I think we've amassed a organization that actually has a lot of influence and buying power. And so everything is about leading with our wallet. If we do that, things will change. And there's enough buying power behind that to do that in a significant manner. And you and I both know these people. They're very, very passionate about it, right? They have the authority to go back and drive things. But I think that we have to think broader than our industry. We have to look outside of this and look at the steel industry, look at auto and every other industry, because they've done a lot of things. Hospitality is a huge one. Can we find a way to leverage those organizations to do something very similar? Can we work together on those things? And then the next one is the federal government. How do we work with each of those different governments around the world to align it? And then other industry bodies that are around sustainability. There's buying initiatives, procurement teams. There's, the clean renewable energy organizations. There's just so many groups that we need to come together on. Just like we brought together our industry, I think we need to bring in more and figure out how we collaborate. That's where we can compound the impact of what we're working on.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I mentioned I'm here at a meeting in Brussels of an organization called GESI, which is the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative. It's all the big telcos, right? And we're all sitting down talking about these exact same issues and figuring out how are we going to build, and the term here is kind of net positive, right? We're going to go beyond that negative in carbon and think net positive across all different kinds of resources and making a positive contribution to society. So I think that's a great way to end it. And thanks a lot, Dean. And Barbara, I don't know if you want us to wrap up now.
I do.
So. Right.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think it's a stunningly interesting conversation that we could have for more. And if people want to join you, we have these other speaker rooms. I want to thank you both for joining us, especially Dean, who got up at 5:30 a.m. at least to join us.
Let's go.
You get the medal for that one. Thanks so much. And moving on, Lisa has our next speaker.